The late summer heat hung heavy over the small Texas town of Millston, the kind of heat that made people cranky, restless, and desperate for shade. Sheriff Lorna Price was a well-known figure around these parts, a tall, imposing woman in her early 40s with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being both fair and unrelenting. She was the kind of law officer who knew every cattle rancher by name, every petty criminal by sight, and every shortcut through the endless expanse of plains. No one could have predicted that she would be on the other end of a police investigation, much less for murder. At 3:45 a.m. on a Thursday, the 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from Lorna herself. "This is Sheriff Price." Her voice crackled through the line, shaky but steady enough to raise suspicion. "I've shot my husband 15 times. He's dead." The dispatcher froze, unable to process what she just heard. A sheriff confessing to murder? Lorna's voice broke through again, impatient and sharper this time. "I need a unit at 202 Riverbend Ranch Road." Now, by the time the first responding officers arrived, the scene was something out of a nightmare. John Price, Lorna's husband of 18 years, lay sprawled across the living room floor, his body riddled with bullet holes. Blood soaked into the plush beige carpet beneath him, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. A .357 Magnum revolver sat on the coffee table, its barrel still warm. Lorna was sitting in a chair across the room, her uniform stained with blood, her hands trembling. "I caught him," she whispered as one of her deputies cautiously approached. "Caught him with our daughter, Macy, in our bed." The weight of her words sent a ripple of shock through the officers. Deputy James Holloway, a rookie barely 2 months on the force, turned pale. "What? What do you mean?" Lorna's eyes were glazed over and her voice was hollow. "He was with her," she repeated. "I told him to stop. He didn't. So I stopped him." Word of the incident spread like wildfire. By dawn, everyone in Millstone knew what had happened, or thought they did. To the townsfolk, it seemed like an open and shut case, a scorned wife catching her husband in the worst possible betrayal and snapping. But seasoned Detective Clara McMillan, called in from Houston to lead the investigation, wasn't so sure. Clara was in her early 50s, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. She'd seen too many cases where the surface told one story, but the truth lay buried beneath. She'd been flown in because, as the sheriff herself was involved, the investigation had to be handled by an external department. When Clara arrived at the ranch later that morning, she immediately got to work. She noticed the ranch was eerily quiet, save for the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. The house itself was modest, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and the kind of charm that spoke of long Texas nights and family dinners. It was hard to imagine such violence in a place like this. Inside, however, the charm ended. Blood spatter patterns painted a gruesome picture, and Clara's trained eye immediately began taking in every detail. John's body was still in place, as she'd requested. The gunshots were clustered around his chest and stomach, with a few straying to his limbs. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, nothing to suggest John had fought back. Clara knelt by the body, her gloved hands gently inspecting the scene. 15 shots, she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning unit. Calculated, intentional. She looked over at Lorna, who was being questioned in the kitchen by another officer. The sheriff was calm, eerily so, as she recounted her version of events. "I came home late from patrol," Lorna was saying, her voice flat. "Walked into the bedroom, and there they were. I didn't think, I just acted." Clara's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't adding up. She made a mental note to dig into Macy's side of the story. The teenager was sitting outside on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked. Macy was the kind of kid who'd always been described as quiet and well-mannered. The idea that she could have been involved in something so horrific was hard to swallow. Clara stepped outside, pulling up a chair beside Macy. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Macy nodded, her lower lip trembling. "Am I in trouble?" "No," Clara assured her. "I just want to understand what happened. Your mom says she caught your dad hurting you. Is that true?" Macy hesitated, her eyes darting around as if searching for the right words. Finally, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I didn't know what to do. He told me not to tell her, but she found out. The words hung heavy in the air, but Clara noticed something peculiar. Macy wasn't making eye contact. Her hands were fidgeting, her legs bouncing nervously. It was the kind of body language that spoke of guilt or fear. Clara leaned in closer. Macy, if there's something you're not telling me, now's the time. You don't have to be afraid. The girl looked up at her, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm not lying, she said, her voice trembling. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being entirely truthful. Back inside, Clara examined the crime scene again, this time focusing on the details that didn't quite fit. The lack of a struggle was one thing, but the positioning of the body was another. John's arms were at his sides, his face eerily calm. It almost looked as though he'd been asleep or unconscious when he was killed. Clara called over the forensic team, who were already dusting for prints and collecting samples. I want a full toxicology report on John, she said, and check the gunpowder residue on Lorna's hands. I want to make sure everything matches up. As the day wore on, more questions than answers emerged. Why had Lorna waited until morning to call 911 if she'd acted in self-defense? Why were there no signs of a struggle if John had been caught in such a damning situation? And perhaps most importantly, why did Macy's story feel rehearsed? Clara knew she was in for a long investigation, one that would test her skills and patience. But one thing was certain: the truth, whatever it was, wouldn't stay buried for long. Detective Clara McMillan was no stranger to difficult cases, but something about this one clung to her like the Texas dust on her boots. It wasn't just the brutality of the act, 15 gunshots from a seasoned sheriff. It was the subtle cracks in the narrative that made her instincts tingle. Something wasn't right, and Clara was determined to uncover it. The following morning, Clara convened a meeting at the Millstone precinct with her team in the forensics unit. The toxicology report on John Price had just come in, and the findings were troubling. John had a high concentration of diazepam in his system at the time of death, Clara announced to the room. It's a strong sedative, enough to knock out a man his size for hours. One of the officers, Deputy Holloway, frowned. If he was drugged, how could there have been a struggle? Didn't Sheriff Price say he was fighting her when she caught him with Macy? Clara nodded. Exactly. If John was sedated, then he couldn't have fought back, which makes Lorna's story inconsistent. Let's not forget the lack of defensive wounds or any sign of resistance. He never moved from that couch. A murmur spread through the room. For many, Sheriff Lorna Price was still a trusted leader, someone who had served Millstone with honor for over a decade. But now doubt was beginning to creep in. Clara held up a file. There's more. Forensics found no gunpowder residue on Lorna's hands, but they did find residue on her uniform, specifically on the sleeves and lower hem. It's possible she fired the gun while wearing it, but it's odd she wasn't holding the weapon barehanded. She leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. And here's the kicker. We found 2 sets of prints on the revolver, Lorna's as expected, but there's another set, smaller, likely Macy's. A hush fell over the room. Clara could feel the weight of their collective unease. Accusing the sheriff was one thing, but implicating her teenage daughter? That was a level of complexity no one wanted to deal with. I'm going to need to talk to Macy again, Clara said finally. And this time, I'm not taking her mother's word for anything. That afternoon, Clara drove out to the temporary housing Lorna and Macy had been placed in after the murder. The sheriff's department couldn't allow them to stay at the ranch, not with it being an active crime scene. The motel was dingy and smelled faintly of mildew, a far cry from the sprawling comfort of their ranch home. Lorna answered the door, her expression grim. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Detective, she said, her voice clipped. What can I do for you? Clara didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need to speak with Macy. Alone. Lorna's eyes narrowed. She's been through enough, don't you think? I already told you what happened, and I'm here to make sure Macy's side of the story matches yours, Clara replied evenly. This isn't optional, Sheriff Price. Lorna hesitated, her jaw tight, but eventually stepped aside. Fine. She's in the bedroom. Macy was sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at her phone. She looked up as Clara entered and gave a tentative smile. Hi. Hi, Macy, Clara said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. How are you holding up? The girl shrugged. Okay, I guess. It's been hard, I can imagine. Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. Macy, I need to ask you about what happened that night. I know it's hard to talk about, but it's important we get everything right. Can you do that for me? Macy nodded slowly. I already told you. My dad, he was doing things he wasn't supposed to. Mom caught him, and she stopped him. Clara leaned forward. Macy, when you say your mom stopped him, do you mean she caught him in the act and shot him right then? The teenager hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Yeah, that's what happened. Clara studied her for a long moment. Macy's words were confident, but her body language was anything but. The fidgeting, the downcast eyes, the slight tremble in her voice. It all screamed that she was hiding something. Macy, Clara said gently, we found your fingerprints on the gun. The girl froze, her eyes widening in shock. What? That's not possible. It is, Clara said firmly. Now I need you to be honest with me. Did you touch the gun that night? Macy shook her head furiously. No, I didn't. I swear. Clara sighed. Macy, I know this is hard, but lying is only going to make things worse. If you touch the gun, it doesn't mean you're in trouble. It just means we need to understand why. Tears welled up in Macy's eyes, and for a moment, Clara thought she might finally break. But instead, the teenager clammed up, crossing her arms over her chest and refusing to say another word. Later that evening, Clara sat in her car outside the motel, staring at the case files spread out across the passenger seat. She couldn't shake the feeling that Macy's silence was the key to everything. If Macy had handled the gun, then there were only two possibilities. Either she was involved in the shooting, or she'd been forced to cover something up. Either way, the truth wasn't as simple as Lorna claimed. Clara's phone buzzed, and she answered without looking at the screen. Detective McMillan, came the voice of the forensic analyst. We've got something else from the lab. You're going to want to see this. What is it? Clara asked, her heart pounding. There's DNA under John Price's fingernails, the analyst said. It's not Lorna's, and it's not Macy's either. Clara's blood ran cold. Then whose is it? We're running it through the database now, the analyst replied. But detective, I don't think this is going to be a simple case of self-defense. As the call ended, Clara stared out at the darkened horizon, her mind racing. The puzzle pieces were shifting, and the picture they were forming was darker and more twisted than she'd ever imagined. The DNA result came back quicker than Clara expected. She was in her office early the next morning, sipping bitter coffee as she pored over the files, when the lab technician called. Detective McMillan, the tech said, we've identified the DNA under John Price's fingernails. It belongs to a man named Edgar Eddie Crane. Clara's brow furrowed. The name didn't ring any bells. Who is he? Convicted felon, the tech replied. Aggravated assault, burglary, and drug charges. He's been in and out of prison for the last 15 years. Recently released on parole about 3 months ago. The last address on file puts him right here in Millston. Clara jotted down the name and address. Thanks. Send me his full file. Already on your desk, the tech said. Clara hung up and flipped through the file that had just been delivered. Eddie Crane was a local troublemaker, well known to the department, but never tied to anything as serious as murder. The fact that his DNA was under John Price's fingernails suggested a physical altercation, a crucial detail that hadn't been mentioned by Lorna or Macy. Clara and Deputy Holloway arrived at Eddie Crane's address an hour later. The house was a run-down shack on the outskirts of town, its yard littered with beer cans and rusted tools. Clara knocked on the door, her hand resting on the grip of her holstered pistol. The door creaked open, and a wiry man in his early 40s peered out. His face was lined with years of hard living, and his eyes darted nervously between Clara and Holloway. Eddie Crane? Clara asked. Yeah, that's me, he said, his voice hoarse. I'm Detective Clara McMillan, Millstone PD. We need to ask you some questions about John Price. Eddie's face paled, and he started to close the door, but Holloway stepped forward, blocking it with his boot. We can do this the easy way, or we can take you down to the station, Clara said. Your choice. Eddie hesitated, then stepped back, muttering under his breath. Fine, come in. The interior of the house was just as shabby as the exterior, with peeling wallpaper and the unmistakable smell of stale smoke. Eddie slumped into a chair, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. What do you know about John Price? Clara asked, taking a seat across from him. Nothing, Eddie said quickly. I don't know the guy. Clara tilted her head, studying him. That's strange, because your DNA was found under his fingernails. Care to explain how that happened? Eddie froze, the cigarette halfway to his lips. I don't know what you're talking about. Clara leaned forward, her tone sharp. Listen, Eddie, lying isn't going to help you. We already have enough to bring you in for questioning, but I'd rather hear your side of the story right here. Why was your DNA on John Price? Eddie's hand trembled as he set the cigarette down in an ashtray. Okay, look. I don't know him. Not really. But I was at his place a few days before he died. What were you doing there? Work, Eddie said. Lorna hired me. Clara blinked. Lorna Price hired you? For what? Fixing their damn fence, Eddie said. She said it needed repairs and I needed the cash. I went out there, did the job, and that was it. Clara frowned. And you had no interaction with John? Eddie hesitated. Not much. He came out while I was working, asked what I was doing. I told him Lorna hired me and he got pissed, said I was trespassing and threatened to call the cops. We got into a little scuffle, but it wasn't anything serious. He shoved me, I shoved back. That's it. Did Lorna know about the fight? Clara asked. Eddie nodded. She came out and broke it up. Told John to leave me alone and go back inside. Clara exchanged a glance with Holloway. If Eddie's story was true, it raised a new question. Why hadn't Lorna mentioned the fight? Did you see or hear anything else while you were there? Clara pressed. Eddie shook his head. No, ma'am. I finished the job and got the hell out of there. Clara studied him for a moment, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. His story lined up with the evidence, but it didn't explain why his DNA was still under John's nails days later, or why Lorna had lied about what happened. You're not to leave town, Clara said finally. We'll be in touch. Back at the station, Clara sat down with Holloway to piece together what they knew. Eddie's story complicates things, she said. If John was already on edge because of Eddie, it could explain why he and Lorna were arguing that night. But it doesn't explain the murder. Holloway frowned. And it doesn't explain Macy's fingerprints on the gun. Clara nodded. Or the fact that Lorna didn't mention the fight. She's hiding something, Holloway. I can feel it. As they spoke, a deputy knocked on the door, holding a stack of documents. Detective, you might want to see this, the deputy said, handing her a manila folder. Financial records for the Prices. Clara opened the folder and scanned the contents. Her eyes widened as she spotted a series of large withdrawals from Lorna's account. Thousands of dollars in cash taken out over the past few months. What the hell was she spending this on? Clara muttered. I'll dig into it, Holloway said. But if she's been funneling money to someone, we need to know who. Clara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they were forming was dark and twisted. Lorna's story was falling apart, and Clara was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The next morning, Clara was up early again, combing through Lorna Price's financial records. The withdrawals added up to almost $50,000 over the past 6 months. The amounts were odd, sometimes $5,000, other times $1,500. The money was always withdrawn in cash with no clear explanation. Why would a small-town sheriff need to withdraw that kind of money? Clara muttered to herself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her office door. Deputy Holloway stepped in, holding a sheet of paper. You're going to want to see this, he said, handing her the document. What is it? Phone records, Holloway replied. Lorna's been in contact with Eddie Crane more times than she let on. Look at this. Clara scanned the report. It showed a series of calls and text messages between Lorna and Eddie over the past 3 months. Most were short, but one stood out. A 45-minute phone call made 2 days before John's murder. 45 minutes? Clara said, raising an eyebrow. That's not just about a fence repair. Nope, Holloway agreed. Eddie's story is starting to look shaky. Clara leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. We need to bring Lorna back in. If she's been hiding this relationship, We need to know why. That afternoon, Lorna was sitting across from Clara in the interrogation room. She looked tired, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Sheriff Price, Clara began, we've been looking into your financial records and phone history. There are some things you need to explain. Lorna stiffened. I already told you everything I know. No, you haven't, Clara said firmly. She slid the phone records across the table. Why were you talking to Eddie Crane 2 days before your husband's murder? And why have you been withdrawing thousands of dollars in cash over the past 6 months? Lorna's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. You've been lying to us, Clara continued. You told us Eddie was just some guy fixing your fence. But these records tell a different story. What's going on, Lorna? For a long moment, Lorna sat in silence, staring at her hands. Then she let out a heavy sigh. Fine, she said quietly. I'll tell you the truth. Lorna's story was nothing like Clara expected. She admitted that Eddie wasn't just a hired handyman. The two had met years ago when Eddie was working a landscaping job for the Price family. They'd struck up a friendship that eventually turned into an affair. It was stupid, Lorna said, her voice trembling. I knew it was wrong, but John and our marriage wasn't what it used to be. He was cold, distant. And Eddie, he listened to me. Clara kept her face neutral, though she could feel the weight of the revelation settling over her. What about the money? I was helping Eddie get back on his feet, Lorna said. He'd just gotten out of prison and couldn't find steady work. I felt responsible for him. And the fight? Clara pressed. Eddie said John confronted him while he was working on the fence. Why didn't you tell us about that? Lorna hesitated. I didn't think it mattered. John was always like that, quick to anger. I thought it would just make things worse if I brought it up. Clara leaned forward. Did Eddie have anything to do with John's murder? No, Lorna said firmly. Eddie would never hurt anyone. He's not a killer. Clara wasn't convinced. Then why were you on the phone with him for 45 minutes 2 days before the murder? Lorna bit her lip, her eyes darting around the room. He was upset, she said finally. He said John threatened him and told him to stay away from me. He wanted to talk about what to do. What did you tell him? I told him to stay calm and let me handle it, Lorna said. That's all. Clara studied her for a moment, trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Lorna's story was plausible, but it didn't explain everything. Not the gun in Macy's hands, not the DNA under John's fingernails, and certainly not the gaps in Lorna's timeline. Later that evening, Clara and Holloway reviewed the interrogation. She's hiding something, Holloway said. I don't buy that Eddie was just some harmless ex-con she felt sorry for. Neither do I, Clara agreed. But we need more proof before we can push her harder. As they spoke, a call came in from the lab. The ballistics report on the murder weapon was ready. Clara picked up the phone, listening carefully as the technician explained the findings. When she hung up, her expression was grim. Well, Holloway asked. The gun was wiped clean, Clara said. No fingerprints, no DNA, but the bullets matched the ones found in John's body. So it's definitely the murder weapon, Holloway said. Yes, Clara said, but there's one more thing. The technician found traces of gunpowder residue on Macy's hands and on Lorna's. Holloway's eyes widened. Both of them, Clara confirmed. The revelation changed everything. The following day, Clara sat across from Macy Price in the interview room. The teenager looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen from days of tears and sleepless nights. Clara knew Macy was the key to the case, but she had to tread carefully. Pushing too hard might cause the girl to shut down completely. Macy, Clara began gently, I need you to be completely honest with me. I know this is hard, but we're trying to figure out what really happened that night. You're the only one who can help us. Macy shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I told you everything already. I was scared and I didn't mean to. Her voice trailed off and she wiped at her eyes. Clara leaned forward. I believe you were scared, but I also think there's more to the story. Macy, the lab found gunpowder residue on your hands and on your mom's. That means both of you fired the gun. Can you explain that to me? Macy froze, her face turning pale. For a moment, Clara thought she might bolt from the room. Then slowly, she nodded. She told me not to say anything, Macy whispered. Clara's heart quickened. Your mom told you not to say anything? About what? Macy glanced at the two-way mirror, her voice barely audible. About what really happened. Over the next hour, Macy unraveled the story piece by piece. According to her, the night of the murder started like any other. She'd been in her room doing homework when she heard her parents arguing downstairs. It wasn't unusual. Her mom and dad fought often, but this time, the shouting was louder than normal. I went downstairs to see what was going on, Macy said, her hands trembling. And that's when I saw Dad with her. Her? Clara asked. Macy's voice dropped to a whisper. One of my friends, Katie. She's only 15. They were together. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. You're saying your dad was having an affair with your 15-year-old friend? Macy nodded, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't believe it. I started screaming at him, and he tried to tell me it wasn't what it looked like. But it was. Katie ran out of the house, and I lost it. Clara let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. What happened next? Mom came downstairs, Macy said. She saw me yelling at Dad, and she saw Katie running out the door. I told her what he'd done, and she snapped. Macy's voice cracked as she described the chaotic scene. Lorna grabbed John's gun from the living room drawer and pointed it at him, screaming about how he'd destroyed their family. Macy tried to intervene, but Lorna was too far gone. She fired the first shot, Macy admitted, but he didn't go down right away. He lunged at her, trying to grab the gun, and they started fighting. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. I grabbed the gun when it fell, and I fired it too. Macy broke down in sobs, unable to continue. Clara sat silently, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. The scene Macy described painted a picture of chaos, anger, and desperation, far from the story Lorna had initially told. After the interview, Clara met with Deputy Holloway to discuss the new developments. Macy admitted to firing the gun, Clara said, but only after her mom shot John first. She says it was chaos, that she was scared and didn't know what else to do. Holloway frowned. So it wasn't premeditated? It doesn't sound like it, Clara said, but there's still something bothering me. Why didn't Lorna tell us about Katie? If John was having an affair with a minor, that changes everything. We should talk to Katie, Holloway suggested. If she corroborates Macy's story, it could explain a lot. Clara nodded. Let's track her down. Finding Katie wasn't difficult. The teenager lived just a few streets away from the Price family, and her parents were eager to cooperate with the investigation. When Clara and Holloway arrived at the house, Katie looked terrified, her face pale and her hands trembling. I already told my parents everything, Katie said as they sat down in the living room. I didn't want any of this to happen. Clara spoke softly, trying to put the girl at ease. Katie, we just want to understand what happened. Macy told us she saw you with John the night he died. Is that true? Katie hesitated, her eyes darting to her parents before nodding. Yes, I was there, but I didn't know he was going to be home. He told me to come over earlier in the day. He said he wanted to talk. What did he want to talk about? Clara asked. Katie's voice shook. He said he loved me, that he wanted to leave his wife and start over with me. I didn't know what to say. It was all so messed up. And what happened when Macy came downstairs? Katie's eyes filled with tears. She screamed at him, and I panicked. I ran out of the house. I didn't see anything after that. Clara exchanged a glance with Holloway. Katie's story aligned with Macy's, adding another layer of complexity to the case. The day after Macy's confession, Clara spent hours combing through evidence, interview transcripts, and the forensic reports. Every piece of the puzzle seemed to fit, but there was still one lingering question. Why had Lorna tried so hard to cover for Macy? Was it simply a mother's instinct to protect her child, or was there a darker motive? Deputy Holloway knocked on her office door. Katie's parents just called. They found a stack of letters from John in Katie's room. Looks like this affair wasn't just a one-time thing. Clara sighed, a mix of anger and frustration bubbling inside her. Let's go see what they found. The letters were a goldmine of information. Written in John's handwriting, they detailed a months-long affair with Katie. He promised her love, a future, and freedom from her teenage struggles. The tone of the letters turned Clara's stomach. John had clearly manipulated the young girl, preying on her insecurities. In one letter dated just a week before his death, John wrote, "Katie, I can't keep this a secret much longer. I'll tell Lorna the truth and leave her. It's you I want, not this life of lies. We'll be happy together, just you and me." "That son of a bitch," Holloway muttered as Clara handed him the letter. He was planning to blow up his family for a 15-year-old girl. Clara clenched her fists. And Lorna knew. She might not have known every detail, but she knew something was going on. She had to. Back at the station, Clara reviewed Lorna's interrogation videos. Something about Lorna's demeanor in the initial interviews nagged at her. She wasn't just angry or distraught. She was calculating. She'd kept her answers vague, avoiding direct eye contact whenever Clara brought up Macy. "Play the part where we asked about the gun," Clara told the technician. The video rewound to the section where Clara had questioned Lorna about the murder weapon. "It was in the drawer, like always," Lorna said on the screen. "I grabbed it when I saw him coming at me. I thought he was going to hurt me. It all happened so fast." Clara paused the video. "Did you hear that?" she asked Holloway. He frowned. "Hear what?" she said. "When I saw him coming at me. But Macy said John was trying to grab the gun from Lorna, not attacking her. Lorna's twisting the story to make it sound like self-defense." "You think she planned it?" Holloway asked. Clara shook her head. "Not entirely. I think it started as a crime of passion, but once she realized Macy was involved, she decided to rewrite the narrative. She's trying to protect Macy at all costs, even if it means taking the blame herself." The next morning, Clara returned to Lorna's cell for another round of questioning. "Lorna, we need to talk about the gun," Clara said, pulling up a chair. Lorna's face hardened. "I've already told you everything. I shot him to protect myself." "Actually, it's not," Clara said, her voice steady. "The forensics don't match your story. You fired the first shot, but Macy fired after you. And we both know John wasn't attacking you. He was trying to grab the gun." Lorna's eyes flickered with fear, but she said nothing. "And then there's Katie," Clara continued. "We found the letters. We know John was planning to leave you for her. That must have been devastating to hear, especially after everything you'd already been through." Lorna's composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes and she looked down at her hands. "He ruined everything," she whispered. "Our family, our lives. I couldn't let him get away with it." "So you shot him," Clara said. "Yes," Lorna admitted. "I lost control, but I didn't mean for Macy to get involved. She was just trying to protect me." Clara leaned forward. "But you let her get involved. You gave her the gun, didn't you?" Lorna hesitated, her breathing ragged. I thought he was going to kill me. I panicked. When Macy grabbed the gun, I told her to run, but she didn't listen. She fired it, and I couldn't let her take the blame for what I started." Clara left the cell with a heavy heart. Lorna's confession confirmed much of what Macy had told them, but it also revealed the lengths to which Lorna was willing to go to protect her daughter. "She's not just protecting Macy from the law," Clara told Holloway later. "She's protecting her from the truth. Lorna knows that if Macy ever accepts what really happened, it'll destroy her." "What's the next move?" Holloway asked. "We build the case," Clara said. "Lorna fired the first shot, and she's ultimately responsible for John's death. But Macy's involvement can't be ignored. The DA is going to have a tough decision to make." Clara spent the next few days compiling the evidence. The ballistics reports, the letters, Macy's confession, and Lorna's interviews painted a complex picture of a family torn apart by betrayal, manipulation, and desperation. When the case was finally handed over to the district attorney, Clara felt a mix of relief and sadness. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious locals, and those connected to the Price family gathered to witness the final chapter of the tragedy that had gripped the small Texas town. On one side sat Macy and Lorna, their faces pale and drawn, a mother and daughter bound by love but separated by guilt. On the other side were Katie's parents, grieving for the daughter they now saw as a victim of John's manipulations. The district attorney had wrestled with how to approach the case. Macy, a minor and arguably coerced into her actions by her mother's emotional instability, was offered a plea deal. In exchange for her testimony against Lorna, she would serve probation and attend therapy. Lorna, however, faced the full weight of the law, charged with second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Clara watched from the gallery, her heart heavy. She had done her job, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there were no winners in this case. The DA opened with a scathing rebuke of John Price's actions, painting him as a manipulator, an abuser, whose selfishness had sown the seeds of his own destruction. But they didn't let Lorna off the hook. She fired the first shot, the DA said, and in doing so, she set off a chain of events that would drag her teenage daughter into the unthinkable. This is a story of betrayal, but also of choices, and Lorna Price made hers when she picked up that gun. Lorna's defense attorney argued that she had acted in the heat of passion, driven to her breaking point by John's infidelity and the revelation of his relationship with Katie. They painted her as a woman desperate to protect her family, even if her actions had tragic consequences. Macy took the stand reluctantly, her voice trembling as she recounted the night of her father's death. She described the chaos, her fear, and the moment her mother handed her the gun. "I didn't know what to do," Macy said, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted it to stop." Her testimony was both heartbreaking and damning, solidifying the prosecution's case against Lorna while casting Macy in a more sympathetic light. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Clara had visited Macy in the juvenile detention center where she was being held. The girl was scared and angry, oscillating between blaming herself and blaming her parents. Clara had tried to offer comfort, but there was little she could say to ease the pain of a 15-year-old who had lost everything. "I just wanted my family back," Macy had said during one visit. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Clara knew Macy's future would be a long road of therapy, counseling, and trying to rebuild her life. The scars of that night would never fully heal, but with the plea deal, Macy at least had a chance to move forward. The verdict came down after 2 days of deliberation. Lorna Price was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge acknowledged her emotional state and the mitigating circumstances, but emphasized the seriousness of her actions and the impact on Macy's life. As Lorna was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned to Clara and whispered, "Thank you for looking after Macy." Clara nodded, though the words felt hollow. Macy's plea deal was approved, and she was released into the custody of her grandparents. The courtroom watched in silence as she walked out. Her head bowed, the weight of her father's death and her mother's imprisonment pressing down on her small frame. Months later, Clara sat in her office, reviewing the case files one last time before closing them for good. The investigation had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to confront the complexities of human behavior and the devastating consequences of secrets and lies. Deputy Holloway walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You okay?" he asked, setting one down on her desk. Clara sighed. "I don't know. I feel like we did everything we could, but it doesn't feel like justice." "It rarely does," Holloway said, sitting across from her. "But you uncovered the truth. That's all we can do." As Clara stared at the files, she thought about Macy and Lorna, 2 people forever changed by the choices they made that night. The truth had come out, but at what cost? A family was destroyed, a community was shaken, and 2 lives were left in tatters. Clara closed the file and pushed it aside. There would be more cases, more families, and more truths to uncover. But this one would stay with her, a reminder of the fragile line between love and betrayal, and the devastating consequences of crossing it. In the quiet of her office, Clara made a silent vow. She couldn't change what had happened to the Price family, but she could keep fighting for justice, no matter how messy or heartbreaking it might be. As she packed up for the day, the weight of the case still lingered, but Clara knew she had done her duty,